Mark Athitakis, arts editor of Washington City Paper, and I'm here with Manil Suri. He is the Silver Spring-based author of two novels. His first book, The Death of Vishnu, came out in 2001, and his new novel is titled The Age of Shiva. Welcome.
Thank you.
Your first novel came out in 2001, and it's been 7 years now.
Yes.
What took so long?
A variety of things. I think what happens is the first novel actually did fairly well, and so there was a lot of attention that I'd never been used to before. Lots of expectation, lots of people telling me what they wanted in the second book and why I wasn't done with it yet.
Right.
And this was like 1 week after the book came out. But more than that, I really wanted to make something, create something that was very different from the first. And so that involved some thinking, and then there was some floundering too. And then there were existentialist questions like, am I a mathematician or am I a writer, because that's my day job, being a UMBC math professor. So it was a combination of all of those. I think that if I was only writing full-time, I could have probably shaved a year off it, but it wouldn't be much different.
Well, there's a difference between the first novel and the second one. The first novel is a very intimate story of what happens in one day, and with a few flashbacks in Bombay, where you go in a very widescreen portrait of what is happening in India in many decades following the partition. How much research was involved in that? I know that you're originally from Bombay.
Right. Well, quite a bit, because I was born in '59, and of course the story starts in '55, but I go back to the partition in 1947, when the country was split apart into Pakistan and India. And interestingly enough, my parents were actually on the Pakistan side, and being Hindu, they had to flee. So right after they got married, they just fled and came to India. And so that was always in my mind, that I'm going to be writing something about the partition at some point. But what happened then was I started reading about Indian history, and I was just struck by this period right after the partition, when the country was first emerging, when the first seeds of modern thought were being laid, were being sown in the country. And I thought that was more interesting than actually writing something about the partition itself. So that's why I chose 1955. Well, the next thing to do was to actually figure out, what did people do then? What did they eat? How much did things cost? What was the atmosphere like? And for that, there was no ready way of doing anything. I mean, we're so spoiled by the internet that anything before the internet you just cannot find on the internet. So I made several trips to Bombay, and I went to the Times of India, looked at their archives, they have everything on microfilm, and just spent hours and hours just reading up old newspapers to get the atmosphere from the 50s, from the 60s, from the 70s. And you know, I don't know how many hours I spent there, but this was just like, it was sort of like letting this wash over me, and then writing later on.
Now, if I understand correctly, you have recently actually come back from a tour of India while you were promoting the book there.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about whether there's a distinction between audiences for your work in India and what American audiences tend to look at when they read your work? Is there a difference?
I think Indian audiences are certainly, they're going to get all the cultural references. So that's a big luxury, which American audiences might not always be able to get. So the challenge for me is always trying to work them into the context so that things are not alienating, and so that phrases, for example, or words in Hindi are properly explained just through the context. But beyond that, I think that there is a difference in philosophy too. American audiences, I've noticed to some extent, really look at the father, Meera's father, who's the central character in the book. He's very liberal. He wants to educate his daughters. He's very modern. He's secular. He has all these points that look great on paper, but he's also very controlling, and he's very oppressive in his own way. And at least some people, some American audiences, not with the final version, but with an earlier draft, they really looked at these points and said, okay, this is a good character and he deserves our sympathy. And that's not what I wanted. Whereas people in India were able to look past that and say, okay, he's obviously, controlling her. So there is that difference, and I'm not sure how it'll play out with the final version.
Interesting, because one thing that you do notice reading the book, that Mira's characters in many ways very much defined by not doing whatever her father is explicitly recommending that she do.
Exactly, because what's happening is that there are few things left for her to do. There are few true opportunities and freedoms for women at that time in Indian history. And so the only way she can really control her own destiny is to react. And so that's why she reacts against what her father does, what her father wants her to do.
Okay. As you mentioned, you are a professor of mathematics at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
Right.
And I have this notion in my head that being a novelist and being a mathematician requires exercising two very different parts of your brain. And is there that sort of a shift when you're working on writing fiction and when you're pursuing your work as a professor?
One day, I swear, I'm going to take some electrodes and tie them to different parts of my head and see if that actually happens. Because people keep saying left brain, right brain. I can never keep that straight, which side is which. But I do feel that, I mean, practically what happens is that if I'm doing fiction, then doing mathematics is a relief. And if I'm doing really hard mathematics, then, okay, this is something to look forward to. For the next few days, I'm going to get rid of this and do fiction. So in that sense, maybe it is what you're saying. Maybe there are muscles that are getting relaxed and then tensed up when you do different activities.
Your new book is the second in a planned trilogy, correct?
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit about the third novel and how far along you are with it?
Okay. So there are three faces to this Hindu trinity, and they are Shiva, who's the destroyer, Vishnu, who's the preserver or the caretaker, and then the third deity is Brahma, and he's the creator. He's a very interesting deity because there are very few temples to him in India. Very few people really worship him. So even though he's a god, he's not really worshipped. And so there's this whole idea that's great for a writer. Imagine being a god and no one pays homage to you. But beyond that, I think what I really see with the third novel is that the first novel was really a snapshot of India. India in contemporary times, 80s, 90s, as you said, it's a snapshot of this building which represents India. The second novel was something that told us how India got to where it is. So it starts in the 50s and goes up to the 80s. How did we evolve to where we are now? And the last novel, the new one, the one I'm working on, is going to be something that projects us into the future. And by future, I don't mean, science fiction type future. I mean something like it could happen tomorrow.
Okay.
But what's going to happen tomorrow? And which is an impossible thing to write, because as soon as you write it, it's wrong.
Right.
But I'm working on it, and I've actually written some. I thought I'd written 150 pages, but I threw away 100 of them this summer.
Okay.
Just because they were, and it was an interesting reason. They were set in Pittsburgh, and I thought, okay, it's time to move away from India and at least have some of the action somewhere else. But then I found that these characters worked so much better if they were in India. So I just threw it away and I'm starting again.
Okay. Why Pittsburgh, if I may ask?
I was in Pittsburgh. I studied there. And, writers are always lazy. We're always seeing what we can use from things that we know rather than doing more research and putting it in a setting which you don't know much about.
Have you ever thought about using this area, D.C., Baltimore, as a resource for your work?
As a setting,
Yes.
you mean?
Yes.
I have, and I'm sure when I was writing short stories, there were maybe one or two that might have had D.C. or Baltimore as the background. But at least for this trilogy, that's not going to happen. And somehow India seems to just always pull me back. I don't know if it has more dramatic possibilities, or if it's just that so many people are writing about the U.S. I mean, so many novels are set in the U.S. Compared to the number that come from India. I don't know. I guess the future will tell.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for watching. And if you want to see more on books and books coverage, go to WashingtonCityPaper.com. Thank you very much.